Mark was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1948, and in 1959 he left Poland and came to Australia with his parents, where he lived for the last 47 years. He's graduated with honors from the Conservatorium of Music in Sydney, piano recitals and concerts on Australian television, among other things. Whether he played in 76 trombones or the drum, I'm not sure, but we can ask him afterward. He next followed his father's footsteps and graduated with distinction from the architecture department of the University of New South Wales in 1973. Within the following years, he received many additional qualifications and awards and also became registered as a chartered architect. He has in his portfolio more than 80 public and private architectural projects, including the award-winning additions to the Australian Museum and the reconstruction of the Sydney Opera House, which included the construction of 3 new floors underwater. He has received many awards and prizes in this regard, and he's also a Rotarian, holds a Paul Harris Fellow, and has served as chair of the Rotary International Service Committee for District 2230. He has often lectured about architecture and Polish and Australian culture throughout Europe, the United States, and Asia, and he was voted best speaker in TEDx in Warsaw in 2011. I might add, by the way, that there is another program, should you be interested, I just thought I'd mention this, called Sustainable Future Designing Buildings to Harness Energy. He's speaking as project team leader for a type of building called Elemental Flow Towers, which generates enough power for its own building and another one beside it if you were to build one. That's a 6 p.m. lecture, September 10th, tomorrow night, in room 1345, Health Sciences Learning Center, 750 Highland Avenue, and I'm sure that either Paul or Karen would be happy to give you that information again after the meeting. So with all of that, Mark, welcome to the podium. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I have to say that after only 24 hours in Madison, I think this is probably one of the best small cities in the world. It's really great, and congratulations. You have a wonderful community feeling here, wonderful buildings. It's just great to be here. I feel at home already, and it's only been one day. So, and thank you to Paul and to Karen for getting this all organized. I'm wearing this funny bow tie, apart from being an egotistical architect. It's actually the colors of Australia, and this bow tie reminds me of what it's like to be in Australia, where the sun is incredibly hot, incredibly strong. We've got the ozone hole right above us, so we get sunburned in about half an hour. But the upside is that we have amazing colors, both in the environment, in the landscape, and also the parakeets and the various wildlife actually have those colors. So I had this tie specially made to remind me of Australia. Also, it is a symbol of architects, and I'm very grateful that some of you have worn a bow tie today, so I don't feel quite alone. But it's really a symbol of architects. You'll notice that Frank Lloyd Wright and Corbusier and various people of that caliber wore bow ties, not only because they had big egos, but also because they were drawing on drawing boards, which were very large, and they drew in pencil. So if you wore a conventional tie, you would mess up your whole drawing. So it wasn't just style, it was a practical reason as well, and that's why I wear this bow tie today, although I won't be doing any drawing today. As I said, it's really great to be here, and I'm going to present you a lecture which to me is very important because I think we have to all think about the future. As Rotarians, our duty is to think about future generations. So I'll present you a lecture which talks about the ecology, about what we could be doing better than we're doing at the moment. I've been an architect for, I'm sorry to say because I feel older that way, but I've been an architect for almost 50 years now. And I've had some great projects, as Ellsworth has mentioned, and I'm very glad that you mentioned those. You've got to be both at the right time in the right place and also have some skill about how to get in the right position. And that worked for me, and I was very fortunate to be working in the Opera House. So now to get onto the actual subject matter which we're going to be talking about, this Out of the Ashes title you see on your screen is the same as we have in the film, which talks about the rebuilding of Warsaw, which was actually the biggest architectural project in the history of the world. They rebuilt Warsaw in 15 years, the old part of Warsaw, without equipment, without money from the Marshall Plan. And the destruction of Warsaw was 4 times bigger than Hiroshima, and bigger than the pyramids, bigger than the Wall of China. There were 16,000 buildings that were destroyed. So hopefully you'll be able to see this film at some time in the future. But it's also the title of my lecture, Out of the Ashes, because I think this is where it all starts. And the two things seem to be going very well together. So if we can have the next slide. It is urgent. It is an urgent matter. We must save the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Many more people are now dying of pollution than of polio. Now, I might just add that I normally have many more graphic pictures in my lectures. That's, as an architect, it's a basic of any lecture we do. However, just before I got on the plane a couple of days ago when I was leaving Europe, the two partner research and development companies of ours asked me to specially delete a lot of the graphics because they have been working for 3 years now with us to develop some pretty spectacular technology. They didn't want me to show all this. So I have had to cut out some of the slides, and it's more text. However, there will be a couple of slides about the pictures, some visual presentations in addition to other graphics. So it's not all text. But normally we would have more slides, but I couldn't accommodate both sides. And we have to protect, through non-disclosure agreements, the information that we're going to show to you. And so I have limited some of this, which we may be able to show later on in the further lectures, which will be longer and more detailed. Next slide, if we can have that. Now, if we can, actually, if you gentlemen could sit slightly to the side, because I think some of the signs might disappear. You can't see the 20,000 years BC. So if you gentlemen near the screen could move a little bit to the left and right, if you could be so kind, because some of the numbers are quite important to us. You know, we don't appreciate the scale of this problem, and we do have a problem on our hands. 20,000 years ago, we used to all sit comfortably around fireplaces, maybe sometimes not that comfortably. But, you know, this was okay when there were only maybe 100,000 people on the planet, maybe even less. But we didn't keep statistics as well as we do now. But now we've got 7 billion people, and it's quite a different situation. We can't really afford to be doing this forever because we will run out of fuel, and also we will pollute the planet very much. So if we can have the next slide. Pollution in the air, the food chain, which is important, the soil and potable water is now at crisis levels. And believe me, with only 1% of the world's water, 1.5%, which if it's clean, is drinkable. We're going to have a problem with water very shortly as well, and it's already happening in some countries. That's really a precious resource, as is also clean air. Without water, you can probably live for a week, but without clean air, you can only live for about 3 minutes. And we're getting to a point where in the next 100 years, we will be running out of clean air, and already hundreds of millions of people are dying now, and the UN report shows that in 2012 there were 10 million people who were dying of health issues related to air pollution alone, not even counting water and soil. So it is a shocking truth. And the costs in healthcare for the people who are not dying yet but already very ill are just gigantic. And you can pick up any Newsweek or a newspaper nowadays, and people are starting to count those figures. We're talking of trillions of dollars in many countries annually in just keeping people healthy who are suffering from lung disease and circulatory problems because of air pollution and water pollution. Next slide. Now, the main problem has been that the human race has for hundreds of years been using the most crude and basic forms of energy production, which you can see up there, and they were okay. Even 100 years ago, that was fine. But the problem is that these are one-way trips. Once you use this resource, it doesn't come back to you, and they pollute the atmosphere. And this is not maybe so serious in the States, but in China, there are many cities where you can't walk around in the daytime unless you wear face masks, or they just tell you to stay indoors. Even in Poland, we have a few cities which are so polluted that my wife can't travel there with me because she can't breathe the air, she can't walk the street. Now, I dread to think what will be the situation in 50 years if we don't take some remedial action right now. We've been talking about it for years. It's time to take action now. The next slide. Moral and social damage is now on an enormous scale. In many cities, the sky can only be seen on giant electronic screens. In Beijing, for example, there are some days where they just have the sky shown on the TV screen so people can see what the sky looks like, because, gee, for 3 days you won't see it at all. The pollution is so heavy. This is pretty serious to me, and I've had a lot of friends who've just come back in the last 2 years from parts of China, and they really can't see the sky, apart from the fact that I can't stay out there very long because I just can't breathe. People cannot breathe without masks in thousands of towns already. So it's not in the future. This is the reality now. Next slide, please. I won't read all this because it's too much, but that's basically how the landscape looks in many industrial towns and cities around the world. It's getting pretty serious. So 2000 AD, we've got this situation. We're still burning the same fossil fuels we were burning many, many years ago, but we're just doing it in much larger quantities. We're not going to change this overnight. We're not going to change it in 5 years, but I think over the next 50 years we should be considering a change, a transformation, because our grandkids are going to be really pretty angry with us if we don't save the essential elements for life, which is air and water. Next slide. This is not a horror science fiction film, this is a reality now. We're not talking about the future. We've been talking about this issue for about 10 or 15 years. I go to conferences all the time, and most of the time I hear about why we can't do this now, because it's too soon, there are too many problems, it's too expensive, etc. Most of those things are just fear strategies which we don't really want to follow anymore because it's getting too late. We have solutions already, and I will show you a couple of projects which would solve this problem gradually. Now I'm saying it's not going to change the world over the next 2 or 3 years. It'll take 30 to 40 years for it to be really effective. However, if we don't start taking action now, we won't be able to just switch on a button in 30 years and say we're going to go all clean. It's a process which takes decades. Next slide. Now, you imagine this. I took this picture in New Zealand because I found it really inspiring to see a landscape which is totally clean. The air is really pure. There are not that many people there, and it's just look at. This is Mitre Peak in New Zealand and Milford Sound if anybody's traveled down that far down. Next slide. Analyzing why we cannot is costing millions of lives. Already, many more lives are lost than from polio. Now, that was a fantastic campaign and a fantastic project by Rotary around the world. But we must plan and act now to stop really serious pollution which is killing millions of people. Next slide. We first need to understand how wasteful existing buildings are. Water, wind, and sun are simply thrown away and wasted by defensive building philosophies of the past. And I'll explain very briefly because I have limited time. Buildings generally throw rainwater away because when you started building 300 years ago, the main aim was to protect the people from the environment. Now it's a whole different situation. In the environment, there are natural forces which are enormous, huge, whether it's rivers, the sun, the wind. All those forces are enormous. We used to always shelter from those because that was the purpose of living in a building. However, the buildings are now way out of date because they still waste rainwater, they still throw away the sun, they shelter us from the wind. If we build buildings in the right way, we should be capturing all this enormous energy, and this can be done without any great expense. It's simply a matter of reversing the way we design buildings. They're not defense mechanisms, they are meant to be absorption systems for those elements of sun, wind, and water. Next slide. Now, I won't go into all of this together right now, but if you combine many energies together, I mean, some people say, oh, we've built a building, we've put on a few solar panels. Gee, it's nice, we've got 20% of the energy created from the sun at 12 o'clock in the daytime. What about the other energy systems, whether it's thermal chimneys, whether it's rainwater, whether it's wind? If you combine 7 or 8 of these together, you will produce energy all the time, non-stop, day and night. Not all of them will work all the time. If you have 3 energy systems working all the time, that's enough. If the sun goes down at 6 p.m. or at 5 p.m., wherever you live on this earth, you already have a reserve of energy if you use your building correctly. For example, you can catch a lot of energy on a large solar roof, and I'll show you an example of this, how this can be done 5 times more effectively than today. When you have this excess solar power, you pump water up to a roof tank on the building. This roof tank becomes a store of energy instead of a chemical battery, which is expensive and polluting. This huge tank on the roof of a building, which also makes the building more stable, becomes a reserve of energy which you drop at 5 to 7 p.m. and drive water turbines in gravity downpipes, which produce a lot of energy when you need it, when the lifts are being used, when the people are cleaning the building. You have to think of what the building has to do. The building should be a production point for energy, and it should also house people, not be in different remote areas. We've been building for so long that we build cities in one spot, we build energy farms somewhere else. Then we've got the problem of transporting this energy and losing much of the power on the way. Also, the remote wind farms and the nuclear stations are very expensive. If you just add 10 to 20% to the cost of a normal building, and I'm talking of high-rise of 15 to 20-story buildings at least, you can produce all this energy locally. Sounds like a dream. It will take probably 20 to 30 years to build enough of these buildings to change the dynamics of a city. But it can be done. It's not that difficult. The process should be started as soon as possible. I'm talking in the next few years. Next slide, please. Now, this guy is a koala bear from Australia. I'm sure you've seen many of these. They are dying out also in Australia because we've cut out too many eucalypts. This is a very energy efficient mechanism because this little animal sleeps most of the time. He eats about 7 out of the 400 eucalypt species that are in Australia because they're the only ones he can actually digest. He is constantly drunk. He's a happy little guy who just walks 20 meters and he falls asleep because he's got to use all his energy to process the poisonous food that he's eating. But that's fine because he's not producing many waste products. He's asleep most of the time. Unfortunately, human beings are not that inactive, Maybe we should be, but you know, I like being a bit more engineering. So these guys fall asleep, but they don't use much energy, but they're dying out. Human beings are much more numerous. There are probably about 7,000 koalas now in Australia. There are 7 billion people on this planet who are much larger and much more energy demanding. Next slide. So, I won't read all this, but just to repeat that thousands of man-hours have already been spent developing these energy systems to work in one structure, in one 3-winged or 4-winged building to catch the wind, to catch the sun, to catch updrafts, to catch thermal currents. All these energy systems, all these energy sources are in the environment next to us. However, we don't use them because we're used to just building bigger buildings in the same way that when they were used to be 2 stories or 3 stories, now we make them 100 stories. I mean, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai is a great example of ego building, but it hasn't got much clean energy. Now they put on a big wind turbine on top of a large building in Dubai, and it works about 20% of the energy that they need. But it's a sales gimmick. You've got to have at least 4 or 5 systems working together in harmony, in tandem, for this thing to work all the time. It's no good having energy at midday and then going back to the grid and still using the grid in the same way, because you still have to have the same grid. I have a vision of the day when in, say, 50 years we'll be able to have no high-power grid systems. It might sound sad, but we can use all this technology to build new wind turbines, new water turbines. There are about 20 different types of just wind turbines which are available now. The windmills in the open farm are fine. They're not all that efficient. They only work about 40% of the time. They have to have the wind coming in the right direction. They don't compress the wind, they're just standing in an open field. There is a much better, newer system, which is a vertical axis drum turbine which catches the wind from every direction. We accentuate this efficiency by making the building catch the wind from many directions and compress it by a factor of 5 or 6. So a wind turbine in the center of a 3-winged or 4-winged building is about 8 times more effective than a single wind turbine in an open field. But there's a next stage of technology. Not next stage in the future. They've been making these things for 15 years already. But why aren't we applying them? Because we get stuck in systems. Once we've got an infrastructure going, we think we can keep it going forever and just make more money out of it. Well, money is not the only object. You can make more money out of clean energy. And in fact, Cambridge University has recently done a 3-year business model of economies which embrace clean energy. And they've worked out that in Great Britain, if they suddenly, it's not going to be suddenly, but if they suddenly were to change over to clean energy, they would increase their GDP by 1.5% over what they are producing now. That's a pretty good result. Many more new jobs. The coal miners in Poland are asking me, when can we start working in photovoltaic factories, making solar panels? Well, I'm saying it's not up to me, but we're trying to work with the government, and it's a slow process because everybody's defensive. Hello, you know, we've been doing this for years. We have to keep on saving the old systems. Well, unfortunately, that won't be a happy result in 50 years' time. So I think we as Rotarians have a duty to save the planet for future generations. We're not doing this at the moment. These innovative systems all exist. Next slide, please. Now, this is the Opera House, which Ellsworth just mentioned. I was very excited to work on this because it was really dangerous digging under all this, 3 floors down, building a bridge to support the building whilst we built underwater 3 new floors for this building. I know how possible it is to use the technology from all over the world to make amazing changes. 25 years ago when I was working on this, this was very dangerous and very innovative, and people said, why the hell are you doing it? We now have an opera house which is almost as good as your Overture Center here in Madison, because you were building it later. And you learned from our mistakes. And we spoke about the architect who designed your center here. It's brilliant. I'm really pleased that you've got this because it's much better than what we have in Australia. However, we actually made an iconic statement back in '73, and then I helped to change it all and improve it in '88 and to '90. So I know how important it is to get a team working together with the latest technology at your fingertips. We should be doing this again, and I'm the guy to do it. I mean, I'm very excited because I've had this experience. I was just at the time when this was necessary in Australia back in '88. But the world needs a new mindset, which we have to embrace as soon as we can. And we have to have people joining forces, and I invite everybody to ask questions either here or later, how we can do this. The technology is there. It's a matter of embracing new technologies and combining them so they work in harmony. It's not just one technology. If you have a car with one wheel, it's not going to go far. You've got to have all these technologies working in tandem 24/7 around the clock. Next slide. Now we have combined, there are at least 8 clean technologies very efficiently working already in various parts of the world, but one at a time. That doesn't really work. You've got to combine at least 5 or 6 of them for it to be totally safe, effective, and supplying enough power for everybody. So if you integrate all this harmoniously, you will wipe out all the gaps in the supply. There will be no ups and downs. There will be just slight fluctuations because sometimes the demand is higher. And I'll talk about this more in other lectures because there's a lot to explain. But if you have the next slide, please. And we don't need batteries, which is another big plus. You don't have to have batteries to keep you going overnight. You actually use the water storage techniques, which are batteries of a form. You have the kinetic energy in water, and you just use this energy at night. In addition to wind power, of course, in addition to rain. All these things can work together because they all have individually downtime. But if you combine them, they overlap each other. And you can have at least 4 energy systems working at any one time. So there'll be enough power from the one prototype that we've designed, and we're looking for somebody to build it for us as the pilot project of the century. We will be able to supply this building and the building next door. Just to show that it all works. It's been all proven scientifically, but we need to start with the developer over the next year or 2. Next slide. Now this is a boomerang. It's my little memory stick from Australia because these guys were not all that advanced technologically. They had no wheel, they had no writing, and yet they lived for 60,000 years without war. They had a totally different mindset. We don't need to change that much in our thinking to create clean energy buildings. But what's nice about this is that this is an element that comes back to you all the time, as does clean energy. The problem with fossil fuels is that if we burn them, that's gone. You can't put them back unless you grow another forest, and it takes quite a few years. But if you use clean energy properly, the energy keeps on recycling forever. You can't destroy or create energy, as Einstein said, but if you use it wisely, it will be recreated into new forms forever. The boomerang was like this. You could throw it, and if you missed, it would come back to you. And it's actually not that hard. I've thrown it many times, and actually it comes back to me. It doesn't actually come up to my hand, but some guys can do this all the time. It's brilliant. It takes a bit of skill, but not as much as it does with clean energy, because we've got to do a new mindset. But these guys already knew about how to make things come back to you. We need this type of mentality in our approach to technology. Next slide. So, as I said, Cambridge University proved that in the business model they've been studying and preparing for 3 years, Britain would grow by 1.5% more. They would create hundreds of new factories, thousands of new jobs. The economy would grow much better than it does in its current format. So change is not destructive. Change actually takes us a step further. You know, if man was meant to fly, he would have wings. Well, if we use that philosophy, we would have never built the airplane. Now, it's not the best form of transport because it's fairly polluting, but gee, it gets us around pretty quickly. I wouldn't have made it here from Australia for the next 3 years if I tried to go some other way. So, I mean, technology has to change and improve our lives. It'd be nice to live in a cave, but I prefer a hotel, as bad as it is, because the hotel is using fossil fuels still. I drive with Paul in an electric car. Wonderful stuff. Unfortunately, it's still plugged into a power system which is fueled by gas or fossil fuels or coal. So we're not quite there yet, but we're already starting to think in positive terms. Next slide. So this is a transition period which will take 40 to 50 years, is my estimate, for at least half the buildings in all high-rise cities. And you know, we're not solving all the problems of the world. We're focusing this on high-rise cities, on cities where buildings are more than 10 stories high. You have the benefits of gravity, of water falling down and driving gravity turbines. So I will rush off to the end because I want to show you a brief video about all this. Living conditions and health will improve dramatically if we introduce all these systems together. The costs will decrease dramatically because we're spending trillions on health around the world. Next slide. It also set new standards in architecture. Now, this is the first picture of the biggest model of this building, and it shows a 70-story building with 4 wings and a huge roof. Next slide. Developers who build the first prototype will set new standards for the world, obviously, because nobody's done this before, provide enormous prestige for the end users, and already companies like IKEA and other giants in the world are saying we're quite happy to pay more because we want to have the prestige of this. They'll be seen as visionaries and trendsetters in architecture and make big profits from the most prestigious buildings in the world, because there won't be just one. After the first one is built, there'll be many, many others that will follow in many variants. We've only got 4 variants designed at the moment. We'll also save the planet from pollution for future generations. Next slide. A much smaller version of this big building concept is even more energy efficient. This time when you go smaller, you actually become more efficient because you have less floors under this giant roof. The giant roof which is spanning 3 to 4 wings of a building. We can provide more details of this if anyone's interested in full details. We have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. But just to show a picture of the smaller building that we have, which is called the Clover. The next slide, please. This is the smaller building called the Clover, 25,000 square meters, about 250,000 square feet and 3 wings. The turbines are in the center, huge roof. There are 7 technologies in this building which work together. Not very expensive. We have costed this, and it's 18% more than a standard building. If we build 3 wings of a building like this with a normal construction, the cost will be 18% less than what we have here. Next slide. So we introduced the elemental flow tower, and next slide again. All powered by the sun using 7 technologies, totally safe, endless energy, virtually no maintenance. I mean, daily maintenance to make sure everything is switching on at the right time. It's all automated. It's not that hard. The technology is here. Now I'd like to show you a 3-minute video. So if we could change to that. This will give you in a nutshell what this looks like and why I've been so excited about this. This has been a 4-year project. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I have a few minutes to answer some difficult ones. So do we have any tricky questions or supportive ones? We'd like to develop this to an even better level. We've solved, we believe, most of the problems. It's doable right now, but I'm sure we can refine it a lot further and we can apply it to individual situations. So if you have any questions, there will be a chance to speak about this in detail on the lower floor from 1:30. But in broad terms, I can talk about this for 4 hours, so don't worry. I don't need to fill in time. But if you have questions, I like to be challenged on this because it's a group effort. If we find something we've omitted, we'd like to know about it. If we find something that's not to your liking, please.
You want to use the mic back there? It would be probably easier for everyone. We're also taping this, so.
Welcome to our club, Mark. I'm Karen Kendrick-Hans, and it's a long-standing tradition in the club that I always ask a question.
Thank you. I'm very glad.
You get the ball rolling. Madison likes short buildings. We don't want anything to be taller than our Capitol building. There's some anxiety about density here. Long, difficult discussion on our block whether we could tear down a functionally obsolete house and put a 26-unit apartment building and some commercial space. So how small a building could one build and have this work, given that we don't like buildings much more than, 14 stories is really big here. Is that too tall in Madison, 14 stories?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned 14 stories because that's the bottom limit. Just so happens. And in fact, I've seen a building in the center when I was walking around yesterday. I think that's about 14 stories. It is a bit overwhelming, but it's already there. Now, if we had been here 2 years before, maybe 3 years, we could have actually put in all these energy systems there. You would have been the world's leader. I'm hoping the next time you build one, you may consider our technologies because it really doesn't cost much more, but it makes a huge difference for a very long time. So 14 stories is about the bottom limit. We like to go 20, but it doesn't get any more efficient. It just means that you have a bigger success. We started with one that was 70 stories high because we wanted to go big. We thought we'd make a big impression. But, people are a bit defensive, and so they don't want to go with the biggest straight away. 14 stories would be very workable and very efficient. And we could use all 7 systems in that. We even could use 8, but we don't use geothermal because we have too much power as it is. And our biggest obstacle, I guess, is that in many countries, you cannot sell to the grid. You cannot be a seller of energy. In Poland, you can't do this yet, even though they're working on the law being changed. In Germany, they used to have a 20% bonus on energy being sold from clean sources to the grid. But they're going to cut that out because the energy producers got a bit too keen. And in fact, photovoltaics got too expensive because everybody wanted them. When they cut out the subsidy, photovoltaics became 30% cheaper in Germany. So, subsidies are not always a big bonus. Sometimes they are counterproductive if they are too successful. But 14 stories, yes. To answer your question, definitely from that level, we would have probably the most efficient building, because we would still have the same large roof over 3 buildings. And the large roof is not a complicated construction. We're basically building a bridge between 3 wings of a building, a bridge which is 90 meters long. Now, you know, most bridges are 500 meters long, 700 meters long. A 90-meter bridge doesn't take much money at all. It's just a larger roof. And then the other big advantage of those roofs is that roofs catch the most amount of updraft. If you notice, during any storm, the first thing that goes on a building is the roof. Now, if you didn't have the roof that was just fighting against the wind, but it allowed it to pass through the wind turbines on the edge of a roof, you make enormous amounts of power, especially during heavy storms. When there are no storms, when you have a lot of sun and you have a steady updraft of hot air, you still produce all this energy through other sources. It's a matter of balancing it out. Whatever the weather is doing, you always have 4 energy systems working. So there's no downtime. It's an ideal which you won't be able to use in every city for at least 30 years, but even in Madison you could at least have maybe 5 or 6 buildings that were using this energy, and you would probably supply 1/3 of your city's needs just from clean energy. Now, this is not going to happen, as I said, in 5 years, so I hope the traditional fossil fuel companies who produce energy from whether it be coal or gas or whatever, or shale gas, they're not going to go out of business in the next 3 or 4 years. It will take maybe 60 years. And the Rockefeller group have already sold Standard Oil because they believed from their advice that traditional energy systems are a little bit outdated and they will become unfashionable and also not really profit-making. So they have sold out of Standard Oil, and hopefully we'll be working with them soon. And there are a couple of other companies that are really interested. We've only just started marketing this whole concept because we wanted to be sure that it works. There are still a lot of final details to be worked out, what windows we'll use, what the Malian profile will be, how much friction it causes. But it's all there for the taking. We could start building this within 6 months when we finish all the documentation. It's a matter of when somebody is willing to take the first step, and then to be the savior of the planet. I think it'd be a rather nice title. I mean, it won't be me because I can't afford it, but well, I could, but you know, I want other people to be involved, because when you talk about this, it creates a whole new mentality. We've got to think, we have to think symbiotically with the environment. We're not fighting the environment.
You got a question?
Yes, please. Sorry, it took so long.
No problem at all. I'm Joel Rogers at Eastern University of Wisconsin here. 2 related questions. One is that in about 30 years, we're going to be at well above 500 parts per million in terms of carbon dioxide in the air. And that's at Eocene level periods. You know, 60 million years ago, when sea levels were about a football field higher than they are today. So there's some urgency to all of this, right?
Definitely.
Most of the buildings that currently exist now are going to be around in that time period, in say 30 or 40 years. What do you have to say about retrofitting existing buildings beyond the conventional stuff, about swapping out the crawl spaces in the attic and otherwise trying to reduce consumption within, reduce the amount of consumption? And if most buildings, which is your focus, are actually built already, if you don't have much to say about the retrofit stuff, then how can you seriously say that redesigning the buildings is going to enable us, as I think you said, to completely replace the need for grid-level storage batteries?
That's a good question. We can retrofit. It's not quite as efficient as starting from scratch because the buildings are built defensively. They don't absorb the forces of nature. We can retrofit, of course, but then the other good factor is that imagine Madison in 50 years' time. I imagine at least half of the high-rise buildings will be new. They don't stay forever. Commercial realities are that you actually either renovate every 7 or 8 years, or you build a new building after 25 years. So if you imagine that in 40 or 50 years' time, half of Madison's medium rise will be new, it will be supplying all the buildings that still remain. So if you replaced half the buildings, they would supply the other half with clean energy. You will be totally energy independent. And that's quite doable because our building produces 200% of the energy that it needs for itself, so 1/2 goes to the neighbor. So we don't need to replace the whole city. We just need to replace half if the world was perfect, and in 50 years' time we could actually have no pollution in cities. So that's the answer to your question. We don't have to retrofit everything. We can just replace half the stuff that's here now with new buildings. And I think that's quite likely in the next 50 years. So in 50 years' time, we'll have a clean city.
That's it. Continue asking. Thank you, and continued if you'd like downstairs, basement, Doty Room 2. Don't forget, tickets, buy them here. The money goes to a good cause. We're adjourned.